Hi, welcome to Reviewing Other People's Work, part of the Biodefense Capstone course. Our agenda today. First, we'll talk about the reviewer's mission. People are sometimes unclear about this. Second, we'll talk about the appropriate mindset for the reviewer to take into his or her mission. And finally, we'll look at the 5-step approach that I'd like you to use for reviewing both capstone proposals and rough drafts this semester. All right, let's jump right into it. The reviewer's mission, simply put, is to help make other people's work better. This may sound very obvious to you, but in my experience, people often forget that this is the central mission of a reviewer. People sometimes get confused and wind up acting like their job is mostly just to criticize or point out weaknesses without keeping the more constructive overall mission of helping someone improve their work in mind. And so, when you think about reviewing, there are really two, in the academic world, I think this is fairly true other places too, there are two major review situations that you'll find yourself in as a reviewer. The first one is in the position that you're in this class, which is to review for a friend or a colleague in order to help them create a better final product that they can deliver to a professor, a boss, a publication, or, in the case of a speech or something like that, to an audience. The second, and less common, frankly, is that you might find yourself someday reviewing for a journal or for inclusion in some publication, maybe a journal or a book, edited volume, or in some kind of conference proceedings, or could be corporate newsletter, could be any number of things really. And so you have a twin mission there. The first is to determine whether the manuscript meets the standards for the publication. Is it good enough, whatever the criteria of good are. And the second thing then is, if it's not quite good enough, but it could be good enough, how to make it better so that it does meet those standards. So in both cases, though, the central mission really is to help ensure that the work winds up as good as it can be, both to enhance the person who's writing it and their experience with whatever they're trying to do with it, but also to make sure, in the case of a review for a publication or whatnot, that it actually meets the standards that they're shooting for. And so, of course, you can only do this by pointing out weak spots and omissions and problems. But the only reason we do those things, those are sort of hurtful and painful things, obviously, for most people. We only bother doing those things because the ultimate goal is to help the author see them, eliminate them, and make the work better in the long run. So that's the central mission, helping other people make their work better. That's our job. So, given that, what kind of mindset, right, do you take into the review process? And I would like to suggest that the reviewer's mindset should be that of an empathic and constructive critic. And here's a note from Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, on how not to do this job. And I'm going to flip over here quickly and show you, since I don't want to embed it, so this is actually the web page. I'm not violating copyright here. So here's the pointy-headed boss, right? Criticize the behavior, not the person, as he goes to talk to someone about their work. And he says to the poor employee, the email you sent to everyone looks as if it had been written by a monkey on crack. Just to be clear, you are terrific, but everything you do is exactly what a moron would do. Okay, not the mindset we're looking for, okay? Not the mindset at all. So what are we looking for? And I will suggest that there are 3 keys to having the right mindset, and they're all in the title of the slide there. The first is empathy. You need to remember that submitting your work to another person for review, makes you feel very vulnerable. Most people feel very exposed, scared, worried. People are worried that you're going to think they're stupid, incompetent, dumb, uninteresting, terrible writer, and so on. And I'll tell you this, that feeling never goes away. No matter how much you write, no matter how long you've been in the business of doing this sort of thing, no one feels very comfortable sending stuff out for review to anyone, friends, peers, journal editors, nobody. And so as a result, when people are vulnerable, they tend to get quite defensive, they get touchy, they get emotional, and that makes it hard for them to be open to hearing even, fairly reasonable criticisms. And so that kind of utterly defeats the point of, reviewing their work in the first place if they're too, defensive and they can't hear the criticism and so on. So a reviewer should approach their task with empathy, taking steps to deliver the critique with respect and in careful language so that the person whose work is being reviewed doesn't, go off the deep end. And the Belcher text workbook has a funny story about this. The woman gets her journal article. She submits an article for review at a journal. She gets the reviews back. The first paragraph or sentence or something like that says the writing is horrible. And she passes out and throws the thing on the ground and is completely upset. And later she goes to cry for several hours. And her husband comes home, picks up the review, reads it, and then walks into the room and says, "Honey, why didn't you tell me you got your article published?" And it turned out the woman was so upset by hearing the criticism about her writing, she didn't bother to read to the end where it said they'd accepted her paper for publication. So that's a pretty good, and that's an academic, right? Person with a PhD, person who's been in the business for quite a while. That's how bad it is for them. I understand it's bad for all of us, especially when we're getting started. So the trick is not to say things in an overly blunt manner that is going to send someone off the deep end who's already nervous about the process. So empathy is the first key to your mindset. The second is the word constructive. Again, the point of the whole exercise is to help make someone's work better, not just to snipe at it and say it sucks. So there's no value to criticism that doesn't help people make their work better. Reviewers should avoid making statements like, "This section sucks. There is nothing good about your paper. There are no interesting ideas in this paper." I mean, frankly, those things occasionally could be true, but they're not useful. And so they're not something you as a reviewer should waste your time writing. You could think it for a minute, but then you got to move on to how to make it better. Your job is to have the empathy, but, to be constructive with your feedback, as the Flight of the Conchords might say. I hope you got that. Anyway, all right, last key to your mindset is that of critic, right? Yes. Assuming you're approaching your task with empathy and trying to be constructive, you still need to be sure that you're working hard to figure out, what the problems are, what's not working, what's missing, what else can be done to make sure the work is better. In short, a reviewer cannot shy away from criticizing the work. If a paragraph doesn't make sense, the reviewer needs to say so, and why. If the writing is sloppy, the reviewer has to say so. Don't work so hard to be empathic that you lose sight of the need to let people know that their work isn't perfect. As an author, on the other hand, you need to be sure that you send your stuff to reviewers who you're confident are actually going to tell you what's going on and tell you the hard truths. Because especially with friends, the tendency is to be overly empathic and not hurt people's feelings and say, "Hey, it's really good, it's blah, 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 whatever. Oh, I don't know why they didn't publish that, when they probably could have told you if they were being honest that it was weak, it had holes, it didn't make sense, your data and methods were off, blah, 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 right? So really the reviewer needs to balance, being critical with being constructive and being empathic. So you want to point out what's wrong, but you want to do it in a way that's constructive, and you want to do it in a way that's respectful and helps people not get over their natural defense mechanisms so they can hear the criticisms, sort of swallow it whole, as people like to say, and move on and create a better next draft. Okay. So then, with these things in mind, let's just talk about the 5-step review process. And I'm asking you to walk through a specific process because I'm going to assume that most of you are not particularly experienced in reviewing other people's academic or policy analytic work. Maybe some of you have a lot of experience with this at work. I don't know. But for the sake of making sure that everyone's doing this in a way that's going to be geez, that's a tough word. Most helpful to other people, I'm going to ask you to walk through a process that I sort of have, baked into myself over the years. And so I use this with students who are writing dissertations or capstone papers or whatever. So the process is the following. First, you need to refresh in your mind the guidelines that the project requires. So you'll reread the review guidelines for either the proposal or the draft, the capstone paper itself. So everything will be fresh in your mind so that you know what you're comparing, what's the gold standard that you're looking for. And you can kind of more easily then see where there are gaps and problems. The second step is then to make what I'm going to call the first read. And during the first read, you're going to use the comment function in Microsoft Word to insert comments as you go along when things don't make sense, when something's particularly good, when you see something that you want to make sure the author comes back and addresses at some point. right? And that's for sort of the tactical stuff. And I'll go through each of these steps in a little more detail in a second. Then once you've done that, you'll go through a second time and then do a higher level review of each of the specific elements and how well it does its job. So the first read is going to be kind of tactical at the sentence level or the paragraph level, where I read that sentence, it didn't make sense. What do you mean? I read this paragraph, I'm not sure what it's doing. What is it doing? The second read is going to be at a higher level. So, there might be 5 or 6 or 10, 12 paragraphs in the summary introduction. And the second read is for you to write, you're going to read it with the thought in mind, how well does the summary introduction do its job? How well does the background section do its job, or literature review do its job? How clearly are the data and methods explained? How good is the discussion of the findings? How convincing is the discussion of implications and conclusions? That sort of thing. So you'll do a second read, and while you're reading it through that second time, you're taking this approach in mind of writing those higher level reviews. Then once you've read it through twice and done all of that, you'll write a final review summary that, sort of a paragraph or two or whatever it ends up being. It can vary wildly depending on the article and what you think is, got to change. And that's where you're going to do your highest level yet summary of what needs to happen. And that's where you're going to try to give the most useful advice you can to the author very explicitly. You're going to say, look, I made a whole bunch of comments on the paper. You can read those. I have addressed each specific section, on its own merits. Then finally, your review summary is going to say, all right, if this is me and I want to make this a better paper, I'm going to, these are the 3 big things you got to fix. This is the most important thing you got to fix. This is the next most important thing, and this is the other important thing, right? Because if you don't do that kind of prioritizing and calling out specific things like that, an author can read feedback as if it's all equally important. So that last one is really important. And then the 5th step, finally, is you'll obviously submit your review to both your writing partner and to me. So let's just go through these real quick. So the first step is pretty basic. I won't bother another slide. Reread the proposal guidelines. All right, that's step 1. Then step 2 is the first read. And again, you should do this on your computer because I want you to use the Microsoft Word comment function. And in a particular way I find is most helpful. And that is, you want to insert your comment. What you want to do is, the way it works, if you haven't used it a lot, is you go up to insert comment or tools or whatever it is, and you insert comment, and then you select with your mouse whatever text it is that you're commenting on. And I've seen people do this better and worse, so I'd like to just say how I think you should do it. If you're commenting on a word choice, just select the word, and it'll highlight that word. If you're commenting on one sentence, just highlight that sentence. If there's a whole paragraph that you think doesn't make sense, highlight the whole dang thing, right? Because then it pulls out a little line to the side that connects the comment box to what you've selected, and that will help the author be very clear about what it is you're trying to comment on. Because sometimes people, when they give me feedback, they'll just insert a comment and it won't be clear what exactly the sentences are they're talking about. And I can tell you that insert comments is a great feature, but if you're not careful as the commenter, it can be not as clear as you're thinking to the author what it is you're commenting on. So be very clear. Another piece on that is, as you're making comments, I know you're the texting generation, a lot of you, please don't use shorthand in any way in your comments, because what makes sense to you in the moment as you're reading it in your own brain does not make sense to someone reading it cold a few days later who isn't in your brain. So please use complete sentences, be as clear as possible, as explicit as possible about what you mean. If some things you don't need to explain a whole lot. Like if there's a paragraph and it's sloppy and it's just fuzzy, doesn't make sense, you can select the whole paragraph and say, fuzzy doesn't make sense. This paragraph doesn't make sense. That's all you have to say. You don't have to say any more than that. You don't have to say exactly why it doesn't make sense. If it just doesn't make sense, just say it doesn't make sense. But if there's something particular, don't think that the author is going to pick up on what you mean unless you're fairly explicit. So this first review is really what I think of as the tactical review. Really focused on the way the author is expressing or describing specific ideas, their methods, the arguments, and so on. And so you should make comments in 3 cases, really. First, when you read anything that's particularly well done, really convincing or worth saying more about. So again, along the lines of being empathic and constructive, it's really helpful for people not, I mean, if you write a paper and let's say 80% of it is pretty good, 10% of it is really good, and 10% of it is crap, and your reviewer only makes comments on the 10% that's crap and says nothing about the rest of the paper, you're not going to have a very good idea, really, of how good your paper is. Because if all you do is read the reviewer's comments, which are all negative about the 10% that's crap, you might walk away thinking, that's not a very good paper I just wrote. So now, I'm not saying you have to, painstakingly comment on everything that's well done, but again, it can be very helpful for authors if they know what's working particularly well. What if they have 3 or 4 arguments in support of something and you find one really compelling, you might drag across and say, you know what, this one is the most compelling of these. You might put this first if they haven't put it first, something like that. Or this is really cool. If you said more about this, it would help the reader understand blah, blah, blah. So that kind of thing is the first time to use a comment. The second, and I've already kind of suggested this, is if you read anything that's confusing or unclear, immediately select it and say, unclear, not sure what you mean. One of the things that's very common, especially with rough drafts, people writing fairly quickly, they're trying to, just get it all on a piece of paper. It's very easy to cut and paste things awkwardly and so on. So, it's very common that I'll read back through my own work and realize I've gobbledygooked together a sentence or 2 or 5, and I don't even know what I mean. So, please be sure. And it's very easy to miss those things because you've typed, maybe enough rough drafts that you're not even really looking at anymore. So very, very key for you as the reader to just select anything that's confusing or unclear and say, hey, look at this. If like there's word problems, sentence problems, that kind of thing, select it, say bad grammar, whatever. And then at a slightly higher level, if you see anything that's just sort of, weak or needs improvement that jumps right off the page at you from the first read, feel free to say that too. Because part of the comment function is for you, the reviewer, when you go back to do your second read, part of what you're going to be doing is looking at your comments to sort of, you're going to be kind of accumulating all the comments and going, as I read over your introduction and I look at all the tactical comments I made, they seem to add up to me to a bigger level issue of, didn't do that as much as you should have, or so on and so forth. So anytime you see something where you're like, I've gotten to the end of the section and it's sort of missing something. In those cases, I tend to select like the last line of the section and I'll say, hey, I got all this far and I don't see X. Why isn't X in this section? It seems to me that it really should be because of, so on and so forth. So that's what I would do. Select the last line of the section to give sort of a little bit of commentary on, what other expectations either they did hit or they didn't hit in that section. And then when you're done with that first read and you've made all these comments, I'd like you to save that document as a new document, and it should have a specific title format. And the title format is in the notes section of the PowerPoint slides, so you should look at those. Also in the assignment guidelines, so there's no excuse for not doing this right. I get tons of these papers in my email, and it's very hard for me to tell them apart the way a lot of people title these things. So here's how it goes. The title format is author name, capstone, right? So if I'm doing a review by Beth Johnson, the first 2 words are Johnston capstone, and then review by and your name. So if I'm reviewing something by Beth Johnson, I'm going to title this review document with my comments in it, Johnson capstone, review by Thrall, right? Or I'm sorry, Johnson comments, review by Thrall, because this is the comments document. You're also going to do a review document in a minute after your second read. That's the review document. All right, so again, Johnson comments by Thrall, okay? All right, step 3 then is the second read. And the second read is more at this strategic level than the first read and focuses more on how successfully each major element of the paper, the introduction, the background, and so on, achieves its mission. So this is going to ask you to kind of soak a little bit in, reread it and get a feel for, does the introduction do all the things it's supposed to? And you'll look at the rubric and you'll realize, okay, it's got to answer like 6 questions. Does it answer all of them? Or is it missing one of them? And that's the kind of thing that when you're reading through the first time, you're just reading to understand. So that's not what you're looking for. It's not going to pop to your mind, oh, hey, it's missing, 2 out of the 6 things that the rubric requires. But when you do the second read, that's exactly what I want you to do. Is I want you to go back and specifically look and see whether the paper elements are hitting what is required by the gold standard set by the rubric. So you're going to go through and you're going to go, all right, here's the rubric says the summary introduction has to be like the following. Then you reread the summary introduction and you go, how did it do? And then you write that down in a new document, which is going to be your review document. And then you go on to the next session. You do the same thing. And so you're going to go through, and for each of them, you're going to write a sort of a project element, paper element review. Introduction, background, data methods, analysis, implications, discussion, conclusion, whatever the sections are, right? And then you'll move on to step 4, which is the last piece of your review document that you will write, is this review summary, the highest level feedback. And the summary has 3 functions. The first is to guide your author's attention to the most important feedback. Again, you're going to potentially write dozens of comments and notes, and it can be confusing for an author to figure out, from the reader's perspective. And again, that's actually the most important perspective because you're trying to communicate to your audience. So when your audience tells you they're confused, you need to be clear about exactly where they're confused and what they think is the most important stuff that needs to change. So you want to guide your author to the stuff that you think is the most important to improve their paper. The second is you need to then provide your best advice about how to improve it. So, here are the most important places where you have weak spots, the most important areas where this can be improved. Your writing or your data needs to be extended, or your methods, or whatever it might be. And then some advice, given that you've now given it 2 very good reads. What is your best advice for how to go about doing that? You might have some thoughts. What kind of thoughts you might have will vary depending on all sorts of things, like how well you know the topic and, whatever, creative thoughts you happen to have that night, So, it's hard to say in advance exactly what that will look like, but do your best to give them some good advice as to how to make it better, within the time allotted and all. And then, maybe like the 3 most important things they could do to make this a better paper. And then finally, the last thing is you want to use the summary to provide some praise and show some respect in order to balance against the, inevitable amount of criticism that you're going to be making. So, instead of just letting them see 20 or 30 or however many comments, you're going to provide some priority. Then, you're going to say, look, I've mentioned all these things, but if you only had to fix, say, 3, if you just focused on these 3 things, this would be a much better paper. If you just tightened up your writing, if you just were more careful about your explanation of the methods, or if you teased out more policy implications in your discussion, that would really be the biggest 3 improvements. And then the other stuff is kind of details, right? That kind of feedback can be really, really helpful. And then again, last thing is don't forget that sharing a rough draft can be brutal with people, and so people are going to be anxious. So you want to take this review summary, which, as you'll see from the template document, it's actually the first thing that people are going to read. The first thing they're going to read is this review summary. So they're going to get this high level, hey, this is a really interesting paper on topic XYZ. It explores all these very interesting things, and it does a great job at this, that, and the other thing. There are 3 areas where I think it could be improved. Generally speaking, this, that, and the other thing. In my comments section, I sort of add a lot of detail about this, and if you have any questions, let me know. That's kind of the sort of thing you might say in a review. And then the person can sort of, in knowing that you're being constructive and empathic, they can be relaxed, and they can read through and see all the helpful comments and feedback you've made. All right, so that's kind of what that's for and where it's going to go. And then when you're done with that, you're going to save that document as the review document. So let me just try to clarify one more time. You're going to have the first read paper that you save as, in the case of me reviewing Johnson, it will be Johnson comments by Thrall, right? Or Johnson capstone comments by Thrall. The next will be the review document that has the summary review and all the element reviews, and you've got a template for that. And you'll save that one as Johnson capstone review by Thrall, right? So you're going to have a comments by Thrall, or whatever your name is, and a review by Thrall, or whatever your name is. And you will then, in your step 5, you will then email those both to your writing partner so the average can get it, and then to me, so I can see how well you've done doing this. Okay, that should be it. I look forward to seeing the fruits of your labors.